Today I'll be talking about Miss Ida B. Wells and her impact on post-Reconstruction. So who was Ida B. Wells? She was a journalist and activist who used these tools to speak out against the atrocities on Black people in the South. She was born in 1862 during the Reconstruction era and became a school teacher in her early teens to finance her own education. She moved to North Memphis in the Mid-South in 1882 during the post-Reconstruction era. And during this time that she moved, the Black community resented discrimination greatly and supported Wells in her protests against Black prejudice that she mainly voiced through journalism. Jim Crow laws were gaining a lot of strength in the South because the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was undergoing several provisions because it was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court under the 14th Amendment that only protected the civil rights of citizens by the state, but not by an individual. And so this spiraled into the southern states enacting many laws that legalized segregation, called Jim Crow laws. And so journalism played a really big role in Wells's work. And so in her early career, she wrote about the struggles of women of color in Memphis. And she had a really positive response from the Black community. So she began writing more and more and used the protection of the pen name Iola. And she was acclaimed to be one of the most prominent correspondents for the Black American press. And so she faced a lot of gender discrimination. One event that happened was in the Cleveland Gazette. They said a photo of her hardly did her beauty justice, and this was responded to in the Indianapolis Freeman that said her photo is fine. Her problem is that she is trying to be smart and pretty, so she underwent a lot of gender discrimination. And later, Wells joined the Memphis Journal, Free Speech and Headlight, and this was under the editorship of Reverend Nightingale, who was a part of the Baptist Church in Memphis. That was the most acclaimed Black Baptist church in Memphis. And so she did the main editorial work in Free Speech and Headlight because Reverend Nightingale was busy with his duties, and she did this work with Native American man from Arkansas, J.L. Fleming. And so journalism had a really big role in the racial crisis in Memphis because about a quarter of a century ago, Black citizens in Memphis had the right to vote, hold public office, and serve on the city police force. And because of Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction era, these rights were being taken away by Jim Crow laws. And so a new generation of Memphians launched a campaign to end Black citizens' participation in society, which established white supremacy. And through journalism, a young white editor of Memphis Weekly Avalanche voiced that they've been saying, if the North will let us alone, we'll work this out in time. The time for that sort of talk has gone by. The young men of today say, we are going to work this out and do it right now, and the North can do all the howling it wants to. So there was a great determination from the young white racists to overthrow Reconstruction, and this was met by a lot of opposition from the Black community. This opposition was voiced a lot in journalism, and Free Speech and Headlight voiced a lot of Black protest in the late 1880s. The white population in Memphis was infuriated by the Free Speech editorial, which had a lot of articles that provoked white people with very racist ideologies. And so Free Speech voiced a lot of the outrage from the ruthless lynching and talked about how lynching is in violation of written law and all the atrocities against Black people, which very much outraged white people. And so they were able to have city authorities step in and force Nightingale out of the community because he conducted a lot of these articles. He was convicted in criminal court on assault and battery, and rather than serving an 80-day sentence in the county workhouse, he fled to Oklahoma. Although he was forced out of Memphis, this did not tamper Black journalism and activism through journalism in Memphis. And so now I'll talk about more the Memphis lynchings. And Wells wrote editorials against the lynchings of 1892, and this was the first thing that brought Wells into the national white American attention. And this began in South Memphis with the People's Grocery. People's Grocery was located on the curve of Walker Avenue and Mississippi Boulevard, and this store was organized by some of the city's most prominent Black leadership. And there's competition from a white grocery store ran by W.H. Barrett from right across the street. Relations between the two stores were always never friendly, and the interactions escalated to physical violence often. And most of these incidents were provoked by Barrett, even though he persuaded Shelby County Grand Jury to indict the owners of the People's Grocery. And so basically, the white owners of this grocery were very threatened by this Black thriving business, and the Black community was enraged by Barrett going to Shelby County Grand Jury and called for a meeting to address the racial prejudice. And so Barrett appealed to Shelby County Criminal Court and charged the competitors with conspiring against whites. Barrett informed the People's Grocery that late at night there would be a white mob to come inflict violence on the store. So this situation escalated very quickly when 9 deputy sheriffs in civilian clothing came to arrest with warrants, the owners of the People's Grocery, and they were mistaken for the white mob and were fired upon. Some of the deputy sheriffs were injured, and most of the Black civilians who were in the store and around ran away, while the deputies rushed in and arrested Calvin McDowell, the grocery store clerk, and Will Stewart, a stockholder. And this was a key trigger for the race riot in Memphis, and Memphis became a, quote, walking arsenal. So the aftermath of this was a lot of acts of violence, and 4 days after the shootout, in the morning, 9 white men, apparently deputy sheriffs, captured Tom Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart from county jail and took the prisoners a mile north and shot them. And so these store owners were lynched, and there's very little chance the murders will ever be brought to trial. And this was the worst act of violence against Black people since the Memphis police riot of 1866, and called for the largest funeral procession in the history of Memphis. And so many other lynchings and acts of violence took place after the incident at the People's Grocery. And most of the lynchings were justified by the propaganda that Black men were seducing or raping white women, and this will be a key factor of the justification of lynching. So here's some imagery in press. This first photo depicts the Southern outrages, which is just depicting a lot of violence and ruthless lynchings by white Southerners to the Black Southerners. And the second photo is a depiction of the stereotype of Black men that was effective propaganda for lynching. And so now we'll go into the anti-lynching campaign, which was where a lot of Miss Ida B. Wells' work happened. And so first she was pushed out from Memphis because she wrote stories about the stereotype of Black men raping white women, which was very threatening to the white Memphans. And because she was making claims insinuating that white women could indeed be attracted to Black men, and it was not just Black men seducing white women. And so the sheriff went and put an end to free speech entirely, and Miss Wells fled north along with Fleming for safety. And while in New York, she joined the New York Age and the Chicago Conservator. So her work began with broadening the nation's conscience, exposing prejudice to the North, and in 1892 she solely launched an anti-lynching campaign. Lynch law had reached its highest level in history, and Wells was very determined to bring this to the public eye and expose the atrocities in the South. She secured support from men like Frederick Douglass and wrote an anti-lynching pamphlet that was distributed at World's Columbian Expedition in Chicago in 1893. Her pamphlets were a red record, lynchings in the United States and Southern horrors, lynch law in all its phases, which is depicted in the photo on the screen. In these pamphlets, she cataloged 241 lynches and abolished the myth that lynchings were justified by the conviction of raping white women, exposing that the majority of these relationships were consensual, and revealing that lynching was just a means of of prejudice against Black people, and it was just a tool for white supremacy. Ida B. Wells continued her work in her trips to England, and so she went to work on exposing the atrocities of Memphis in England through a lot of lectures and editorials. And she was invited to go to England to help begin an organization of anti-slavery movement in 1893. And the lynching of 1893 made Memphis her main target for exposing the atrocities there and gaining support from England. And so she knew that Memphis did have a weak spot and that they did care about their reputation and commercial prosperity, even though they were committing so many acts of violence. They didn't want to be seen as a bad place. And so her pamphlet, United States Atrocities, and other speeches voiced how lynching was a new tool to harbor white supremacy and how bad the brutality was in the South. And so from all her lectures, she had a lot of support from the British. They responded very empathetically to her story and the stories of others and invited her to return for another trip. And the support these lectures produced gave her a lot of special interviews with tons and tons of newspapers, and these eventually flooded back into white Memphis press. So back in Memphis, now that the global public eye had a stance of the brutality, and another key thing was the unchristianity and immorality of the Southern whites, Memphis has a target on its back and is now feeling threatened. And also because of this exposure, it gave Black people more pride that they never succumbed to the violent nature of Southern whites, even though they are deemed as savages. And the English opinion had a great influence on the Memphis civic leaders. And so these lectures made Memphis feel very threatened, and they tried to defend themselves, saying that Miss Ida was exaggerating and that Memphis is indeed a decent place for Black people to live, but now the global world knows that this is not true. And the final accelerator for her work was the Memphis lynching of 1894, shortly after she returned, where 6 Black people were accused of burning down a barn and were shot while being brought back to the Shelby County Jail. And white Memphians had a very unexpected response and actually called for action to bring justice to the Black people who were murdered and convict the lynchers. So this grand jury court case happened because Shelby County grand jury indicted the 13 white men for murder, responding in a very opposite way from their past. And it was noted that the hope for conviction was the death penalty. And the grand jury stated, very opposingly to their actions in the past, "We cannot close this report without expressing our horror of the cold-blooded, brutal butchery of these 6 defenseless men, the cruelty of which would cause even a savage to hang his head in shame." And although they never succeeded in capturing the lynchers, there was a great need amplified for lynching to end and the brutality against Black people to end in the South. And this event put end to crime in the city for 2 decades. And Miss Wells was a huge driver of all these ideals. She brought the horrors of the cities to the public conscious, and she held the hatred that was voiced in these cities accountable. She brought equality to the forefront through her journalism and brought a lot of change to the South and America.